Thanks for coming out this morning, and thank you for the invitation to speak. So I'll be talking a little bit about social media and talking about science out in the world on the internet, and some of the considerations if you're going to do that, some of the reasons why it might be a good idea, why it might not be a good idea, what you have to worry about when you're thinking about talking openly in public about science online. So I'm going to start with a little clip from an article that was released just last month about why you should never talk to the public online. So this was in the Chronicle of Higher Education, behind a paywall, and the argument that was made here was that using things like Twitter, academics are ruining our reputations, and we're sure. And we are we're being too casual and too flippant. And it says, so there are just a few clips. Academics do not lack for means of transmitting scholarship and ideas. We teach, write, and lecture. These are time-honored activities of the scholar. And then they go on to contrast that with Twitter and say that this erodes the very social legitimacy that enables academic culture to exert its influence. They have a couple of quotes. Academia is public apart from the public world of politics and education. It's closed to those who cannot understand its conventions or think, speak, and act through its particular registers. This is considered a positive thing by the author. And it says, they say, engage with us, say our learned journals, but only after you have constituted yourself as one of us. So the author of this piece is saying that the advantage of academia is that it's closed, it's exclusive, you have to go through special training, and we should never disseminate our information in ways that don't have those barriers because we will lose our legitimacy. And I and many other people who talk about science online thought this was exactly why we should be talking to the public, because these kinds of barriers, these kinds of social constructions that exclude huge huge swaths of society are actually very, very bad for academia, bad for our place in society. So just to contrast, social media versus the academy, obviously we're doing different things, right? If you're talking to the public online, you're doing something different than writing in a journal. There are different purposes to writing in a journal versus talking about things on Twitter or Facebook or whatever. With social media, it's open, it's public, it's casual. You get very immediate feedback. If you say something online, people will very immediately tell you what they think about that, how it reflects their experiences, their lives, and so on. And there is a kind of peer review that happens on social media. It's a little spotty because anybody can jump in for any reason. There's no vetting, but it can also be extremely useful. And we've seen that in a few cases where there have been scientific results presented that have then, through the process of everybody in the scientific community being able to see that and members of the public, it changes the picture that comes out of that. I mean, Bicep 2 is an example of one way in which the fact that there was all of this public information out there changed how we talked about the results and ultimately led to a different outcome in terms of the final answer for that experiment. So there are ways that once you put your information out there and make it as public as possible, you just get much more feedback. And of course, using the archive, we all know that can be really, really useful as well. Academia, on the other hand, it's professional, exclusive. There's gatekeeping. These are things that help in terms of vetting the kind of perspectives that you get, which can be useful and also can be a problem. It requires long-term investment. You have to really be involved, and things are not immediate. You don't get feedback right away, and that can be good and bad. You can do things over a longer time horizon. And there is peer review, but again, it's spotty. When anybody who's submitted a paper to a journal knows that sometimes the peer review is helpful and sometimes it's not. So a combination of a more public kind of peer review and a more sort of codified peer review can be a useful thing. So the key points, why would you want to talk to the public online? Why would you want to do this sort of thing? There are several reasons that I would call professional reasons, things that might help your career in some way. Networking. You meet a lot of people who are also talking about science online, and you can get to know your community outside of your own department, outside of meetings like this. You can also talk to people who are just very disconnected from where you are and what you're doing. You can get information about what's going on in various fields. If people are talking about a big result, there's a lot of information there that you can get without having to pester the PI of the experiment over and over, or without having to be at a particular talk or meeting. You can promote your own work, share what you're doing and what you're excited about. You can build communication skills just through having to explain things to people who are not already experts. That's a great way to get better at talking about your science, which is also great for things like funding applications, giving talks, everything like that. You're part of a global conversation about science, about academia, about just life in general, and that can be a helpful thing. You might be able to influence policy or the media. Twitter specifically is just full of journalists, and so it's a good way to connect with people who are writing the stories about what we're doing as scientists. You can build your public profile, which can help you be more known, to get invited to things, help people see what it is you're working on, and when you're moving up through academia, that is potentially an extremely helpful thing. And there are also personal reasons. Social connection, commiseration when you need it. If you're stuck in your lab for 12 hours and your experiment's breaking, you can tweet about it and people will cheer you on, you know. You can connect with people at your same career stage, you can get advice, you can get sort of virtual mentorship from people at other institutions who are not connected to you professionally, but who might be really helpful for the position you're in. Then you can just blow off steam, look at cat pictures. That has been shown by some studies to help reduce stress. Watching videos of cats playing can make you feel better. I mean, so these are kinds of things that can be very, very useful. And when I've asked other academics if they thought that Twitter or other social media has been good for their career, a lot of people say, well, I don't know if it's good for my career or not, but it's definitely helped my life. It's definitely, you know, given me access to a lot of things that I wouldn't have access to, and made me feel better about my position or things like that. Some people say it's terrible. There are differing opinions, you know, but these are some of the ways it can help. But when you're thinking about whether or not you're going to dive into social media or how you're going to use it, there are some considerations you should have in mind. Why are you doing this? Are you planning to become a science superstar? Are you planning to connect with your colleagues? Like, what is it that you're hoping to get out of the experience? It's important to know that before you dive into it. You have to know who you're talking to. There are some people who really just talk to other physicists, or most of their output on social media is fairly technical, fairly focused. They don't talk about their lives, and that can be really useful if all you really want to do is have conversations like the kind of conversations you would have at a meeting like this, just all the time. Goals. What do you want to happen out of this? Are you planning to get a job through having more connections? Do you want to make sure that everybody in the world really understands how your experiment works and why it matters? You know, think about what your goals are, and then think about a strategy. How are you going to approach that? What kinds of things do you want to talk about? What kinds of information do you want to share? How much of yourself do you want to share when you're in this process? Those are all things that you need to make sure that you're not just doing this haphazardly, because if you want it to be useful to you, these are the things you have to keep in mind. When we talk about social media sort of within academia, a lot of times people describe this as kind of a conference coffee break, but for the whole world. It's the same kinds of conversations you can have at places like this. You can have these online just all the time. So if you're going to do that, there are some things you should keep in mind. Interact with people. When you're online, Comment on other people's statements, like ask questions, promote work that you think is really interesting. That kind of interaction, that kind of engagement is a really important part of it. Just broadcasting is something you can do if you want, but you're going to get more mileage if you actually make connections. It's okay to promote your own work and accomplishments. A lot of people are very shy about that, but if you are able to just say, hey, I did this thing, hey, my paper's out, people will see that, and that can be very useful to you. Try and keep your tone positive for the most part when you're specifically interacting with colleagues online, because otherwise you're just going to be a downer and nobody's going to want to hear what you say. Be useful. What I mean by that is you can educate, you can connect people, you can provide support and insight. If somebody is very useful online, you're going to want to see what they're having to say, you're going to want to follow what they're doing. Things to keep in mind, everything is public. Depending on the platform you're on, things like Twitter, Instagram, public Facebook pages, these are all public. So just keep in mind that they're public and also they're on the record forever. That can be kind of daunting, but it's just something that you need to make sure that you're always aware of when you're talking online. Respect people's boundaries. Don't constantly sort of poke somebody. Make sure that you're interacting in a way that is comfortable with everybody. Be professional in the sense of, conduct yourself in a professional way the way you would at a scientific conference, but don't be like a robot, right? So bringing some part of yourself, your personality into what you do online is really, really important, even when just talking to your colleagues. Now for the rest of the talk, I'm going to focus more on talking to the public, because I think that's sort of more the focus of this session, but I wanted to say briefly just about how even just talking to your colleagues can be very useful. I'm using mostly pictures of myself in this slideshow just because I have rights to them and I don't have to worry about it. But anyway, so when you're talking to the public, it's useful to know kind of what the landscape is in terms of how the public sees scientists. One of the things that people talk about a lot is this idea that today people are very hostile to science. And largely that's not really borne out by the data. Scientists are largely pretty much trusted. They're some of the most trusted groups in public life in terms of talking about science. So maybe we're not trusted for other aspects of life, and I'll say a little bit about that later. But at least when we're talking about science, we're much more trusted than, for instance, journalists or elected officials. There is a high degree of trust in terms of people think we know what we're talking about. And so that's a really useful thing. They might not agree with our views about what should happen in the world. That varies. But for the most part, people really do trust scientists quite a lot. It does vary by country. And there are trends in different places about how much scientists are trusted or seen as good and useful for the world. So you can look at those kinds of trends and try and draw conclusions about why that might be. But the US is kind of somewhere in the middle of that picture. But people don't know who we are. Most Americans cannot name a living scientist. This is from 2017. 19% of people said they could name a living scientist. And the ones they named are largely the ones you've probably heard a lot about in the media. It hasn't gotten any better. It's in fact gotten worse. In January 2018, it was down to 16% could name a living scientist. And if you'll notice, the vast majority, well, the majority of the responses, the most chosen person was Stephen Hawking, who passed away in the middle of 2018. So I'm not sure what this pie chart looks like now, but it's probably worse. So there's a lack of understanding of who we are. There's also a lack of understanding of what we do. Knowledge of science is somewhat limited. 86% of people will say that they know little to nothing about science. And a lot of people, a lot of people who don't know anything about science also say they don't want to know anything about science. So that's a little bit of a disappointment there. And this is a really interesting result. A lot of people think that we are cold and heartless and amoral. There are stereotypes about scientists that we will kind of do anything for the data, you know, and that we don't take into consideration morality or human beings when we are after, you know, solving that problem. I think this largely comes from depictions in the media of mad scientists and evil geniuses and things like that, but there's also a component of this that has to do with the history of science's impact on society and the way certain large institutions of science have affected people in their lives. And so we need to make sure that we understand that and grapple with that science has not always, in every case, been a force for good in the world in terms of its impact on people, and a lot of the public will take that into consideration when they're thinking about how they think about scientists. I also think that these kinds of surveys are really troubling when it comes to things like whether or not scientists are trusted on issues like climate change or vaccines or things like that. If it's true that we're cold and amoral and heartless, then maybe we are just trying to get our data and get our funding, and we don't actually care about people, and then we're motivated to lie. So these kinds of stereotypes about scientists can be very, very damaging for our impact on the world, for the way that people interact with scientists. So just in case you can't read these captions, this one is the blue is what they said, whether they said it's true of a scientist. The purple is whether they say it's true of a regular person, whatever that means. This one is prefers knowledge acquisition over preventing harm. So scientists win that one a lot. Can be obsessive in their quest for knowledge, losing sight of other things. Is capable of doing something disgusting for the sake of curiosity. And this one's reverse scored, so it's the opposite of cares more about preventing harm than gaining new insight. So we care less about preventing harm than gaining new insight, according to these poll respondents. So that's something to keep in mind when we're talking to the public, that we do have this stereotype to overcome. And that ties into why I think that a lot of us, when we do talk about science in the public, we're doing it wrong. So this is from a survey about objectives for doing science communication. Like when you ask academics, why are you going out and talking to the public about science? And most people say they want to defend science or inform the public, or maybe some excite the public. The least chosen answers are build trust or tailor their messages to the audience. And this is bad because it's been shown that the things that are most effective in communication are things like building trust and tailoring your message to the audience. People really respond to who's speaking and why and how. And given that we already have a problem with people feeling that they can't relate to us because we're cold and amoral and heartless, the fact that we're not spending as much time as we should on building trust and tailoring our messages to the audience can be a really big problem. So this is something that we need to keep in mind, that just defending science is not necessarily going to be effective. Just informing people is not going to necessarily be effective. We need to really think about these other aspects. So key points, how to do this if you're talking to the public. Trust is really key. Connection is really key. Finding some connection with the people you're talking to, building trust with that audience, those are really, really important aspects of this kind of work. People respond strongly to people, stories, and emotion. Okay? These are the things that, as humans, we are wired to respond to listen to keep in mind, to remember. These are the things that are going to make your messages resonate. Keep in mind also, when you're talking to people about something that might be controversial, motivated reasoning is a very powerful force. And keep that in mind when you're talking about your own stuff as well. You might have reasons to believe something that might not just be what the data are telling you. And you should always question yourself about why you believe something, and also keep in mind that other people, the people you're talking to, might have really good reasons not to want to hear what you have to say. Prioritize your efforts. So One thing that I often say when I'm talking about my own science communication, I have to prioritize my effort, and explaining to flat earthers that the planet is round is never going to make the cut. Okay, so there are things that I will choose to focus on or choose not to focus on. Really think about where your effort in science communication is going to actually be useful and possibly help make a difference. And it's probably a good idea to give up when you face such hostility that you're seen as part of a global evil conspiracy. Probably that's not a good place to spend your time. Engaging in bad faith discussions is counterproductive. If somebody's arguing with you and they clearly just want to make a point and want to, smack you down, you're probably not going to get anywhere in that discussion. So talking about science online can take a lot of your time. It's really important to prioritize, to not spend all of your time, yelling at people or being yelled at, because that's not going to be effective use of your time. It's also important to keep in mind that facts are necessary but not sufficient when you're talking about science. There's a model of science communication called the deficit model. This is an idea that's been around for a while, mostly as an example of what not to do. So the deficit model is this idea that if only people had all of the information, then they would agree with me. And so all I need to do is put that information into people's heads, and then they will agree with me. This doesn't work. The reason it doesn't work is because even if that information is totally true, if people don't trust you and believe you, they're not going to listen to that information. They're going to find ways around it. They're going to use their motivated reasoning and find reasons to doubt what you have to say, to doubt the measurements, whatever. So just throwing facts at people is never going to be effective. The facts alone don't stick. They don't necessarily hurt. There have been studies that go back and forth on whether or not giving people evidence that they are wrong makes them believe they're wrong thing more. There's an ongoing discussion on how much that is really true, or how much that is sort of an illusion based on other things. It's not really clear right now where the science is on that, but if you're presenting facts within a context that's not challenging to somebody, they're more likely to accept those. If you're putting facts out there, it's not necessarily going to hurt your case just to provide the facts, but it does need to be part of a bigger conversation. So humans communicate through emotion, stories, shared language, relationships. This goes back to the people, emotions, and stories. Sorry about that. That's how we talk. That's how humans in general communicate with each other. We connect on emotional levels. We have relationships. We tell stories. We share experiences. We use shared language. Just because a certain term is the most correct term doesn't mean it's going to be the most effective term. Think about that when you're thinking about how you talk about science out in the world. As an example of that, there was a time a while back when I had an opportunity to talk to somebody about the sort of distribution of the planets in the solar system. And the way I did that was not to show a chart of the heliocentric model of the solar system. What we did is we were outside, we had a telescope, we were looking at the moons of Jupiter through the telescope, and I told a story about how Galileo looked at these moons of Jupiter through the telescope and saw them moving from night to night, and he was able to see that there were something moving around a body that wasn't the Earth. And this changed the whole perspective on how the solar system is laid out. And this was a story that, as you can see from this fuzzy picture, was much more effective than just drawing a diagram would have been. That kind of story, that kind of direct experience can be really, really effective, rather than just, here's the data, here's a diagram. A while ago, I made a little post-it note of social media tips. These are still valid as far as I can tell. Number 1, be interesting. Number 2, be nice. 2A, if you can't be nice, be funny. Interact with people. Be yourself. Unless you're a terrible person, then C2. That's all part of building that personal connection and also not antagonizing people. Those things should be pretty obvious, but a lot of times when you're faced with just a text box, it's easy to forget that there are other people on the other side of that text box who will take things personally. So things that seem to work well. Humor is always very helpful. Make sure that it's not a kind of humor that is upsetting people. But this is my most popular tweet of all time, looking at the orientation of the planets and the sun and the moon and the Earth during an eclipse. So moon, Earth, sun is a lunar eclipse. Earth, moon, sun is a solar eclipse. Earth, sun, moon is apocalypse. Every time there's an eclipse, this thing gets retweeted. It's great. So that kind of thing, that if you can show something cute that makes people laugh, people will share that and they might learn something. So now, every time people share this, they see, oh, this is how the bodies of the solar system are arranged during eclipses. Pictures and videos are really helpful. Shorter is better for those situations. Nobody has time for a 20-minute video anymore. Attention spans are dropping. Another reason you might not want to be on social media, but that's a whole other conversation. This is a picture of a drawing of how orbits work based on the idea that if you just, fire a cannonball off a tall mountain and you fire it fast enough, then you can get it to orbit the Earth, and orbiting is just constantly falling. I did a little Twitter thread about that a while back, and it was one of the most popular Twitter threads I ever did. It was Orbital Dynamics. It doesn't sound that exciting, that interesting, but there was a little picture, and I was able to connect it with people's lives, and people really dug that. It's not always clear what people are going to like before you put something out there, so there's a lot of experimentation. Personal stories and experiences are always good. Again, that connection, that building relationships. It's, I think, really helpful as scientists for us to be visible as whole people, and so that people who are not scientists can get to know us. That's part of building trust. It's also part of showing the diversity of different life experiences, different demographics within academia. I think that can be really helpful and really important. If somebody gets to know you, they're less likely to think that you are a shill of big energy or something like that. Like, there are advantages to being known and to sharing things that are, somewhat personal online, because that's how people will connect with you. And so you have to choose your own level of how comfortable you are with being, with sharing your life online. But when you share some personal things, when you connect with people on a level that's not just your science, they are more likely to care about and trust your science as well. Eureka moments, those are always popular, those are always effective. I'm sure that everybody has seen the photo of Dr. Katie Bowman going like this when the supermassive black hole picture came back. It was super, super viral because everybody loves to see that excitement that we have when we make a new discovery. So that's something that we should very much be encouraged to share. Awe and wonder, again, we, in physics and especially in astronomy, we have a huge advantage with the awe and wonder bit. So we can talk about, the amazingness of the physical world and how things work at the tiniest scales and how things work at the largest scales, and all this counterintuitive stuff with quantum mechanics. All of those things are very popular and really connect with people. It's also great to share just your own enthusiasm about something you think is really cool, even if it's not something that you think that the world would think is really cool. If you are enthusiastic about that, people connect with that. They might just think, oh, that's cute that you're so excited, but they will connect with you on a more personal level. This is an example I like to show. I'm going to show it on the next slide. It's a 12-second video, literally, of water boiling on a pot on the stove. It says, the text of the tweet is, the whole watch pot never boils thing is just propaganda to prevent you from enjoying the awesomeness of fluid dynamics. 12-second video, water boiling on the stove, 576 retweets, 1.7 thousand likes. You never know what people are going to get into. I think people saw this, and they just saw that I was really excited about this for reasons maybe they didn't understand. But then they look closer, they see some of these little caustic patterns in the bottom of the pot, and they're like, oh, that's actually really cool. I've never looked very carefully at that before. So helping to change people's perspective on things that they encounter all the time can be extremely effective as well. General advice. Changing people's minds is hard, especially when you're trying to do it. People can tell when you're trying to influence them, when you're trying to manipulate them. Don't be transparent about that if you're doing that. But also, you do sometimes want to change people's minds, but you have to be upfront. You have to be, at least come off as genuine when you do that. Sometimes people are just trolling. You're going to encounter this a lot when you talk about science online. Sometimes people will just want to mess with you. You have to have strategies to ignore or remove yourself from that. Blocking and muting and just not responding is okay. You don't have to respond to every single comment that you get. Sometimes it's just a waste of time to do that. Sometimes the best use of everybody's time in the whole picture is just to move away and not engage. Pay attention to your attention. What I mean by that is you only have a limited amount of attention to use in your life at any given moment. Pay attention to where that's going. Make sure that you're not spending all of your time just scrolling through Twitter if that's something you are in danger of doing. Think about what you're investing your attention in and whether or not it's productive. No one's entitled to your time. If they demand it, it's a bad investment. If somebody goes to you and says, you must debate me about climate change, it's not a good investment of your time to answer that challenge. So think about when people are demanding your time or your attention, think about these other things. You have your priorities, and you need to keep that stuff in mind. Some closing notes. Do you have to? No. You don't have to do social media. You don't have to talk to the public at all if you don't want to. Consider how to best invest your time. If you really feel like talking about science online would be a waste of your time and would be ineffective, and you don't think you would get anything good out of it, don't do it. Nobody's forcing you, and you shouldn't do it if you feel that you're just going to be grumpy about it, because then you're not going to be doing a good job. Will it help your career? Maybe. Maybe. I've written a couple of papers that with co-authors who I mostly interacted with online and had never met in person before we started our conversations about science. So you can make connections with people, you can get ideas, you can build your own profile. There are all sorts of things that might come out of this if you connect with people online. It won't necessarily help your career. It's unclear. The data are unclear. There's some data that say that papers that are tweeted get more citations. Some say maybe that's not a cause and effect thing. You don't know, but think about things that might help your career in this process, and if you think those are worth pursuing, then focus your attention on that. Will your institution mind? You have to ask. You have to, if you're tweeting in a sort of professional capacity with your institution, prominently displayed or something, they might care about what you're saying. Talk to your institution if you're worried about running into some kind of policies there. I know that people who work for NASA have to be very, very careful about what they say online. I've never had any issue. No institution has ever told me to stop. Even when I get super political or whatever, they don't really care. So it just varies. You should talk to somebody. What about trolls? Trolls are unavoidable. They're out there. They are much more unavoidable if you are in an underrepresented group. So if you are basically not a straight, white, cisgendered male, you're going to get more trouble online. Think about strategies for that. Connect with other people who might have strategies for that. And think about sort of where your boundaries are and how to set them. And that's it. I can take questions.
Thanks, Katie. And we certainly have time for a few.
I was thinking of your advice about how to interact with people in the context of my remark about emphasizing outcomes, not motives. It sounds like what you're saying was Saul Alinsky's message of talk to folks where they're at, not where you're at. Speak to their concerns in their language. Yeah. And then from the resulting trust and relationship, eventually you'll get to talk about what you're interested in. Is that what you were saying?
Yeah, that's a big part of it. Find places where you have shared values, where you have shared experiences, connect on that level, and then that can lead to other conversations. Don't just right away say, I want you to believe this thing. It has to be more nuanced in the longer relationship sometimes. Yes?
So it was very interesting to see your slides about how much trust we get. And of course, somewhat disappointing to learn that I'm cold and immoral. I wanted to make a comment that language, meanings of words and language drift.
Yes.
And so, for example, science has been around for a long time, and we should expect a certain amount of drift in the public. On the other hand, new words come in, and for example, in industry and business, there is a phrase, data-driven, that is generally very positive. People respond well to it. And to me, it always meant that this person is doing science, and in some cases just doesn't know about it. And so the actual community of scientists is much wider than people who just know that they are scientists. If you could comment on that, would be great.
Comment on that there are more people who do science than people who identify as scientists? Yeah, I mean, that's certainly true, and that's increasing all the time, especially with things like citizen science and more ways to interact with scientific research. And then there's also, depending on how you define science, there's a lot of science that's done outside of academia, outside of, research institutions. So yeah, it's a huge tent these days.
Hi.
Hi.
So, quick question. How do we make progress with climate change deniers when both sides have their own motivated reasoning? And as you said, facts aren't sufficient?
So it varies. There's a lot of research into this, and I don't know enough about what the numbers are in terms of how many people can be swayed in each direction. There are some groups and some individuals who are taking very specific approaches that are potentially more effective. So for example, one of the most prominent climate scientists online is Katharine Hayhoe, who is she's a climate scientist who connects with people who are religious and sort of in more rural areas. And so she uses her connections to those demographics personally to connect more with people on the science side. And I think she's been very effective by clearly demonstrating she has shared values with her audience, and then building from there to a message. There are groups that promote sort of environmentalism through biblical what's the word? Like biblical motivations or frameworks as stewards of the land and all of that. That can be very effective for some groups. So finding ways to connect on a personal level, on a values level, is I think the only way that's been really effective to change people's minds. And you don't jump right in and say, you're wrong, I'm going to tell you why you're wrong. There has to be a longer, more detailed conversation than that. So that personal connection is, I think, the only thing that's been really shown to work. Sometimes people change their minds just by seeing a lot of data out there, but there's so much information out right now on every side of this question that most people don't know who to trust. They don't know which websites are legit, which ones are not, which data makes sense, which ones don't. So it does have to be about that personal connection.
Yeah, I'm on Twitter, but I don't have enough to say every day. I don't even think I have something to say every week.
Yeah.
And so what I'm wondering is it, because then I just feel like it's not even worth it. And so is it worth it to be on social media if you only post sporadically?
Well, it just really depends on what you're trying to get out of it. So you can certainly get the information gathering part of it without posting your own stuff all the time. You can interact with what other people are saying. If somebody has a really good idea, you can say, oh, I like that idea. You can build connections without having your own sort of broadcasting to do. So there are times when I don't say anything at all on Twitter, but I might like a bunch of posts, or I might retweet something, or comment to somebody, but I don't have anything of my own to say. It depends on how you want to use it. So I would say, think about your strategy, think about your goals, what you want to get out of it. If it's something that you think could be useful as more of a reading and maybe commenting rather than broadcasting thing, then that could be very useful to you. So it just depends on how you want to use it and what you want to get out of it.
Hi, thank you for the wonderful talk.
Sure.
So I think one of my favorite things about being a scientist is sort of the community and the sense of camaraderie that we have.
Yeah.
Sometimes that can sort of translate as a want to kind of come to your colleagues' defense, especially in the online sphere. So is there a way to do that tactfully without having it kind of turn into a mess of what looks like a bunch of PhD students or professors come and stifling, other people's opinions?
So you're talking about like if somebody puts out a statement of some kind and then people are attacking that statement, that kind of thing?
Yeah, and then so a bunch of their friends who are also scientists come in, and so it comes into this battle, sort of like what you talked in the beginning of like, well, you have a difference of opinion, but I have more experience in the field, and so it doesn't isn't something that we necessarily want to turn into as a way to put down conversation, right? So how do we effectively communicate wanting to defend our colleagues in their work while also helping propagate information to them?
Yeah, so in those kinds of discussions, sometimes things can get really heated, can get really antagonistic. When I get into those discussions, I try to just stick with positive statements, say, I really agree with what this person said, or if somebody's saying something that's just not true about that topic or about that person, I can say, well, here's some other information. I think maybe you've misunderstood. I try and keep things from being an all-out fight, because the all-out fights don't go well.
So we have last question.
Okay.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the talk.
Thank you.
You made a passing comment early in the talk about Bicep 2.
Yeah.
And I was just kind of curious, not from the science perspective, but from the science journalism, social media perspective. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Okay, so I'm part of a public science course at NC State, and I did a whole lecture on Bicep 2 and what it tells us about open science and all of that. I think it was a really, really interesting and very, very complicated situation where every aspect of open science kind of came together in a perfect storm. So the openness of having these lectures online that people could take PDFs from and process that on their own, that openness could have been helpful, but then the information was misinterpreted, so that was a problem. And then the openness of then the discussion afterward helped to solve that problem. But the fact that people couldn't get the data, the results ahead of time to prevent that mistake from propagating was a problem. The fact who the media went to talk to was a problem, because other experimentalists couldn't see the results before they were released, and so there was this huge announcement, and a whole bunch of people didn't get a chance to fully vet it before they commented. So there were all sorts of things that went wrong, and I don't think there was any one place where I could say this was the problem. I think it was really kind of a perfect storm of a lot of situational kind of things coming together, a lot of circumstances. But I also think that ultimately it was the open discussion within the community that kind of had to be public for it to be that open, for it to include everybody included, that helped us to reach a final answer. I think that in terms of how the public saw that, unfortunately, I think that open process wasn't publicized in a way that could have been really, really helpful for showing people how science works. I think that's one of the things, I didn't mention it so much here, but one of the things I think is so important when we do science communication is to show the process of science, show how it works, show what it really means to build consensus. That was all out in the public, but I don't think it was really covered by the media at the same level as the initial announcement. And so I think that was sort of a missed opportunity of showing how rigorous and open and free science can actually be when it's happening in real time.
Okay, I actually had a question.
Sure.
Michael Lewis has spoken recently about the change in our society, the diminishing role, lack of respect for referees in the greatest sense that is behind concerns about truth, fake news, et cetera, et cetera. You talked about a lot of positive effects of Twitter and social media, but science and traditional political discourse have relied for centuries on the existence of referees. You can argue they're authoritarian and they can be repressive, but we certainly in the scientific community appreciate and depend on some authority and some process of refereeing. Social media appears not to have referees of any sort. Do you have any concerns about the danger of losing?
Well, I think that as scientists, we are maybe uniquely sensitive to the fact that we should be making our decisions based on what the content of what's being said and not who's saying it. And so we are in actually a better position than most to skip the referee, the established referee part, and really look at what people are actually saying and evaluate those statements on our own. That doesn't mean that it's necessarily good for the world in other aspects, So I think that the fact that it's a sort of free-for-all can be a problem, especially when a lot of bad science is propagated and there are all these algorithms that push those things to the top. But I think that for science and for the kinds of discussions that we want to have, it's hard to see too many downsides of opening up peer review and discussions more and more. There are trade-offs, obviously. There are places where things can go wrong, but I think that for the most part, when I've seen broader conversations and more people able to put in their input, that for the most part makes the science better and makes ultimately will make conversations better. So it's not an efficient process, but neither is a traditional kind of referee system if you consider how many people are excluded from that and how many perspectives might not be heard. So I think there are big trade-offs, but I think that for a lot of what we most care about, the greater openness is an advantage.
Okay, let's thank Katie again.